Mrs. Miller. How are you? So I'm going to continue reading stories for little folks. And this one has a poem in front of it. It's called, What is a Rainbow? What is a rainbow? Does anybody know? Where does it come from? And where does it go? Do the fairy artists paint it on the sky with their magic brushes dipped in fairy dye? Do they get their colors from the setting sun and mix them with the dawn lights until everyone, blue and green and orange, violet and red, in that bow of beauty across the heavens spread? What is a rainbow and where does it go? Can anybody tell me? I should like to know. This story is called Miss Kitty's Cats. Very appropriate for me to read something about kitty cats. As most of you know, I have 7 of them. If you watched any of my Beezus and Ramona videos, you would have seen that I had Hobbs with me on one of them. He just came and sat on my lap. So I enjoy having kitty cats, so I hope that you like this story too. Miss Kitty Curtis was a lover of cats. In fact, among the citizens of Old Town, Miss Kitty's neat white cottage at the intersection of Plum and Oak Streets, with its apple green shutters, its trim picket fence, its kitchen garden, and its flower-bordered walks, was known as Cat's Corner. No, not that they called it that to Miss Kitty. Oh dear no. For Miss Kitty was an able and respected citizen of Old Town. She had lived there all her life, as had her parents and grandparents before her. The Curtis name was an institution in Old Town. Old Colonel Curtis had built the bank. He had also given the circular park on which the town hall was erected. There had always been a Curtis in Old Town, and Miss Kitty was the last of the long and distinguished line. Now, Miss Kitty was a sane and sensible person. She was always ready to donate to or help with this or that worthy cause. But peculiar she was on the subject of cats. How many she had, no one in Old Town was able to say, and she kept getting more all the time. Here's a picture of all those cats. Looks like a good place to me. There were no stray cats in Old Town. If they were not owned by the inhabitants, they somehow found their way to Miss Kitty and became her cats. The door of her latticed back porch was never closed, and there was always room for one more cat. Plenty of soft, clean cushions lined the benches built on the 3 sides of the porch, and deep saucers of milk stood side by side on the floor under the benches. These saucers were never empty, for Miss Kitty was a good provider, replenishing them often. Miss Kitty was what is known as a worker. Early any morning, winter or summer, she could be seen sweeping and cleaning her cottage, shaking and airing her cat cushions, and scrubbing her porches and walks. Then, if the day were bright and sunshiny, she would hitch up her pony, Dolly, whose home was the old Curtis stable with the weather vane on top, and drive out in her trim little phaeton. Some days she drove north out of town, some days she drove south. On other days she was known to drive east, and on still others west, on country roads around Old Town. Often it was dark when she got home. What do you suppose she was looking for when she drove out with her pony and cart? Miss Kitty was looking for a cat. Not an ordinary, common, everyday, like any other kind cat. Not even a bobtail cat. This was a special, particular kind of cat. A mittenfoot. I don't know a mittenfoot. Once, long years ago, Miss Kitty had owned a mittenfoot cat. 6 toes instead of the usual 5 on each of his 4 white feet. 24 toes in all, making a peculiar sound when he came padding down the walk to meet Miss Kitty when she came home from school. We call those polydactyl cats now. And Miss Kitty had loved her Mittenfoot, loved him more than any other cat she had ever seen, before or since. But somebody had stolen him. Of course, that was long before she grew up, long before she lived in the Curtis cottage by herself and started taking in cats. And although she was fond of all her cats, she still kept a special spot in her heart, which she felt would never be filled until she had another Mittenfoot cat. One particularly fine August day, Miss Kitty finished her housework in record time, dressed herself in her best, and hitched up Dolly with extra speed. For last evening, as she was clipping her hedgerows, the judge, who was her next-door neighbor on the Plum Street side, had brought her some news. Here she is, riding her pony and cart. I would love to have a pony and a cart, wouldn't you? New people had moved onto the Jenkins farm at the crossroads and were known to have brought some cats with them, he had said. And so this August morning, Miss Kitty was in a hurry. Excuse me. As she stepped onto the phaeton, she said to Dolly, "Step aside, step along briskly, my dear. This may be the day." And Dolly stepped along, for the crossroads is some miles away, and Miss Kitty hoped to get back in time for the festival which was to open Old Town Homecoming Week that night. But with one thing and another, it was dark when Miss Kitty got back home. Her errand had been in vain. She was disappointed and tired. The homecoming festival, as far as she was concerned, would have to get along without her. She was going to bed. As she came up the walk, Miss Kitty was confronted by as miserable a cat as she had ever looked upon. Thin and ragged, dirty and mean-looking, she showed her teeth in an ugly snarl. When Miss Kitty stooped over her where she stood, her back arched and her eyes glittering, Miss Kitty forgot she was tired and disappointed. Here was a cat who needed care and food and a home, yes, who needed her. That's how I feel. Miss Kitty knew how to talk to cats. In no time at all, she had this one eating from a saucer of milk, and before the evening was over, the cat permitted Miss Kitty to bathe and dress an ugly sore on her forepaw. And because she was wary and unfriendly, even though she did submit to her treatment, Miss Kitty took a cushion and made her a bed in the stable. But next morning she was gone. However, by night she was back, and Miss Kitty again took care of the sore foot, fed her, and put her to bed in the stable. By the end of the week, she was growing into quite a respectable-looking cat. Miss Kitty gave up going to look for her in the stable mornings, for she simply was never there. All that week, the days were dark and cloudy. It wasn't until Friday that the sun shone, and Miss Kitty dressed her in her spiggered skirt, and went to the stable to hitch Dolly. Here's a picture of her with the straggly looking poor little kitty cat. As she opened the door, a loud meow greeted her. Miss Kitty saw her latest homeless cat standing and waving her tail proudly by her cushion. Miss Kitty was overjoyed to find that this patient of hers had at last consented to stay on her premises overnight, and was reaching out to pat her when a series of weak little cries made her stop stiff. They went, and Miss Kitty knew that kind of cry. It came only from teeny tiny, very young kittens who feel blindly for a mother cat that isn't close by. This particular mother cat was at the moment rubbing against Miss Kitty, trying to say, "Here they are, mine, but yours if you want them." And Miss Kitty could hardly believe her eyes, for as she picked them up one at a time, she discovered that 3 of the 5 kittens were Mittenfoot cats. She's so lucky. Miss Kitty Curtis, best sprigged silk dress, mitts, bonnet, and all, sat right down on the stable floor and gathered them all in her lap. Didn't I tell you she was a lover of cats? Needless to say, Miss Kitty doesn't drive into the country every bright, sunshiny day anymore. Instead, she can be seen most any day at all, driving about Old Town with 3 Mittenfoot cats on the seat beside her. That story actually makes me a little bit teary. I kind of like that one a lot. I hope you enjoyed it. Here she is on her little cart with her 3 little kittens. All right. Thank you for listening. Talk to you later.